Hey everyone, just a quick video on replacing the power steering pump reservoir tank on an SN95 Mustang. This procedure will apply to both V8 and V6 powered Mustangs. The tanks are going to be in slightly different positions, but essentially the steps you're going to go through are relatively the same. So in my case, I needed to pull this tank off because it was leaking on me. It actually had developed a leak here on the top in the back. And so every time I put the car up on jack stands to do some work on the car, I would have power steering leaking down onto the floor. They can get cracked. A common place for them to fail is actually at the bottom. One of these attachments for the hoses that go to the pump can crack and you get power steering fluid leaking down the hoses and onto your garage floor and over everything else in the front of the engine as well. So if you have any of those issues, or if it just looks nasty and you're trying to dress up your engine a little bit, I would say go ahead and replace the tank. They're pretty cheap. This is the replacement tank here. Cost me $30 at a local parts store. They're available at every auto parts store, so there should be no issue with getting a new tank. And it's a pretty straightforward procedure to go ahead and replace them. So you're going to want to have the car up on jack stands, both sides, the front and passenger side wheels off the ground, because in addition to replacing this tank, we're going to go ahead and flush the power steering fluid system as well, since we have it sort of open and apart. So one of the first things you're going to want to do once you have the car up on jack stands is to take the cap off and siphon out as much of the power steering fluid out of this tank as you can. In my case, I picked up a super cheap turkey baster for $2 at Walmart and was actually able to get all of the fluid out of this tank using this cheap turkey baster. So a quick and dirty method that worked really well. Got all the fluid out of there. And then I went ahead with starting to disassemble the tank itself. It attaches on a V8 here on the driver's side, and there's 3 bolts that hold it in. You got 2 on the top right here, and then 1 down on the bottom left at the front of the tank here. You do have 2 hoses that attach at the bottom, and you're going to want to take those off first before you actually remove the bolts up here. They can be pretty difficult to get off, and so it's helpful to have the tank stationary and held in place in order to get those clips off. You'll notice that there's a couple of metal clips that hold that hose onto the tank. You're going to need to get a pair of pliers and pull those together and move them down to release the pressure on each hose, and then you're going to have to wriggle that hose off of each attachment point on the old tank. I found that a little WD-40 helped in getting the old hoses off the old tank, and just a little spray sort of right here at the top where it met up with the base of the tank helped to just loosen it up and get those 2 hoses to release their grip on the plastic tank and come off. You're going to want to inspect these hoses too, because if you have a leak, it may be that your tank is cracked. It may be that the hose has some issues as well. And these are just standard rubber hoses. These aren't the pressure lines that connect to the pump to the rack and pinion. So they can be easily replaced if there are issues with the hoses. So be sure to inspect those once you have everything off. But you're going to want to remove those hoses first. And then you got 3 10mm bolts to remove up here, and then the tank comes right out. And you'll essentially have it off, and be almost ready to replace it. 2 things that I highly recommend doing while it's off of the car. This area right here where it attaches gets incredibly caked with just grease, grime, dirt, all kinds of nastiness. So it's a good idea to clean that area up since you do have the tank off the car. Degreaser helps quite a bit. I actually used 2 different kinds. I used this super clean foaming degreaser, but I also picked up at O'Reilly's this engine degreaser. And the engine degreaser was helpful. It's just a little more powerful for the really sort of caked on, burnt on areas where it's like, greasy. This is just a nice foaming degreaser that sticks really well. And so if you've got some areas that you need to scrub with a wire brush, or with a trying to pick away some dirt with a rag, it's just a nice degreaser that sticks to the parts while you're trying to clean them. So I highly recommend cleaning that area since you have that part off as well. The other thing that I highly recommend doing since you have this part is to go ahead and flush your power steering system. So you already have quite a bit of your old power steering fluid out by draining that tank. So since you have the car up on jack stands, it's pretty easy to get the remaining power steering fluid out when you're replacing this tank. So this larger hose that you can see right there actually connects to the bottom of the power steering pump. And so you can just undo the hose clamp, pull that off the bottom, and make sure you have a drip pan positioned underneath the power steering pump before you do that. But go ahead and pull that off, and all of the fluid that is actually in the pump will drain out into your drip pan. And then once you have that off, you're going to leave that off and then just turn your steering lock to lock several times. And that is going to force all the fluid that is in the rack and pinion unit out. Some of it is going to come out through that bottom port on the power steering pump. Some of it is going to splash out through this hose here. But in either case, as long as you have that drip pan position, it should catch all of that. And that will clean out, the majority of your fluid. You'll get a pretty good flush by draining that pump and then cleaning out the rack and pinion. I turned it lock to lock 6 times, and that seemed to, by the 5th and 6th time, there really wasn't any fluid coming out either the bottom of the pump or out of any of the hoses, so it really seemed to clean it out pretty well. But just turning it lock to lock will flush out any remaining fluid that is in the system that wasn't either in the tank or these hoses or the pump itself. Once you have that done, then reassembly is pretty straightforward. You're going to go ahead and just bolt that new pump back on. So again, you've got those 3 10mm bolts, and you want to go ahead and just hand tighten them for now. But you want that pump, tank secured before you start wrestling with these hoses down here. And then you're going to force each one of these hoses back onto its connector on the bottom of the tank, and then be sure to reattach those clips. Grab a pair of pliers, pull them together, position them up right snug against the bottom of the tank, and release, and that'll secure both of those hoses to the bottom of the tank. And then you're going to want to go ahead and tighten up these bolts and get them nice and tight. You don't want to over tighten. That is a piece of aluminum you're looking at there, so you don't want to break it in any way. But get them nice and tight, keeping in mind that it's a plastic tank and an aluminum piece that it's bolting into. And then you're ready to refill the system with fluid. And so make sure you check the capacity specifications for your system in terms of how much power steering fluid you're in, and follow the procedure for adding power steering that you can find in a Haynes manual in terms of making sure you get the right fluid in there, and also bleeding out any air that is in the system. And so you're going to be doing things much like we did to flush the fluid out of the system. In order to get the air out of the system, you're going to need to fill up the tank, and then start moving the wheels side to side and get the fluid moving through the system. And after you do that a few times and refill the tank a few times, after you've kind of done it by hand a few times, and you don't see the tank emptying out as much, then you're going to want to go ahead and start up the car and get that pump spinning, and it'll instantly suck fluid down and push air out. And you'll see air bubbling up through the remaining fluid in the tank. And just keep topping it off and run it for a few minutes until you see the air bubbling subside in the tank. And then just make sure that the fluid level is topped off and correct. And you can shut off the engine and you're done. So if you found this video helpful, please be sure to like and subscribe. And be sure to check out the other videos out on the channel.